The Earth was quiet, not in the peaceful hush of a gentle dawn, but in the heavy silence that follows devastation. 252 million years ago, the planet had endured the greatest extinction event in its long history, the Great Dying. More than 90% of marine life was gone. Forests had withered into grey wastelands. The air carried the weight of ash. The seas tasted different, briny and unsettled. It was as if the Earth itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would dare rise from ruin. But silence never lingers forever. Beneath the cracked ground, seeds waited, their tiny green futures protected in husks of patience. Along rocky shores, the waves still whispered against stone, carving new shapes from ancient cliffs. Even in the empty deserts, winds curled across the sands, sculpting shifting dunes. Life had not been erased, only tested. And in that fragile balance, small creatures began to move. If you had been there, standing atop a ridge of Pangaea, the view would have been staggering. The supercontinent sprawled endlessly in every direction, a single colossal landmass stitched together from Earth's plates. Its heart was dry and searing, a desert so vast it seemed to have no edge. Winds rolled over it in hot, shimmering waves, carrying dust that strung the eyes. But further out, the landscape softened. Jagged mountains carved from volcanic fire, deep canyons where rivers traced silver threads through stone, and coastlines where oceans foamed with slow, patient rhythms. The skies above were harsh yet mesmerizing. Clouds formed in towering columns, heavy with summer storms that rarely offered relief. At night, stars spilled across the heavens in dizzying abundance, unbroken by the glow of cities, stretching far and sharp. The Milky Way arched like a pale river across the darkness, a reminder of time's vastness. Here and there, life flickered against the silence. Tiny lizards, no longer than your hand, darted between rocks, their scales glinting like polished bronze under the relentless sun. Some crouched at the edges of shallow streams, quick tongues snapping at the few surviving insects. Others clambered onto warm stones, lifting their heads toward the light, as if to claim their fragile inheritance. These reptiles were not yet kings. They were survivors, wary, quick, unassuming, but they carried something that would change the course of Earth's story: adaptability. They could endure heat and dryness. They could find cracks to hide in, prey to hunt, seeds to nibble. Their bodies were efficient, conserving water, built for persistence. In a land where so many had perished, these humble forms found a way to remain. Walk further into the heart of Pangaea's wilderness, and you might find the first hints of rebirth. Along certain valleys, groves of conifers began to gather strength, their tall trunks reaching for the sky. Their needles whispered when the wind passed through them, a sound that would have felt almost holy in the silence of a recovering world. Beneath them, the ground was littered with cones and shadows, and reptiles made their homes there, slipping quietly between roots. The air was hot, dry, and heavy with the scent of resin from broken branches. Yet after rain, the land carried a sweetness, the fragrance of damp stone, of soil remembering what it meant to host life. Thunder cracked often, echoing across the wide land, followed by brief downpours that carved new channels through the dust. And when storms passed, steam rose from the earth like a living breath. To the west, where the land met the ocean, the waters told another story. Waves pounded against cliffs, gullies filled with tide pools, and fish, though fewer than before, darted through their hidden worlds. And here too, small reptiles ventured, their clawed feet leaving delicate trails in the wet sand. They came not to rule, but to survive, waiting for the chance to spread further, to become more than remnants. And so the Age of Reptiles began not with thunder, but with whispers, not with towering beasts, but with flickers of motion in the corner of your eye, with glimmers of scales beneath a merciless sun. It was an age born from patience, a slow claiming of the earth, stone by stone, forest by forest, coast by coast. The reptiles carried the promise of what was to come. From these small bodies would one day rise the thunderous steps of dinosaurs, the sweep of wings that cut across the sky, the deep power of marine leviathans. But here, in this fragile dawn, they were simply survivors pressing forward. The silence of extinction was ending. The rhythm of scales against stone had begun. And Earth, scarred but alive, was ready to tell a new story. The Earth, for all its resilience, still bore scars that stretched across every horizon. The Great Dying had ended, but its presence lingered in every stone, in every ripple of the seas, in every empty forest glade. It was not just an extinction, it was a silence that had remade the world. Imagine stepping across what had once been a lush plain of ferns and towering trees. The ground is no longer green but grey, littered with trunks that have fallen and hardened into lifeless monuments. Ash mixes with soil, crunching beneath your steps. The air feels thin, dry, and strangely bitter, as though the world itself has not yet remembered how to breathe. The oceans, too, had changed. Where once reefs dazzled with corals, sponges, and creatures of every shape, now there were only skeletal remains, pale and fragile, tumbling in the currents. The water held a dullness, its colors muted. Fish were fewer, their schools scattered. Some swam in silence, ghost-like reminders of what once had thrived. Waves still broke on the shores, but they did so without the chatter of countless lives clinging to tide pools. The sea had lost its music. Across Pangaea, the land stood as if emptied of its voice. Deserts stretched wider than before, their sands shifting under relentless sun. Valleys lay hollow, rivers running weak and shallow. The storms that swept across the supercontinent carried dust more often than rain, choking the skies with veils of ochre and red. When lightning forked across the heavens, it illuminated not green fields, but barren stretches, lonely and waiting. And yet, among these ruins, signs of stubborn persistence could still be found. In the shadows of cliffs, small fungi worked quietly, breaking down the remains of the dead, weaving new soil from old. Tiny, wiry plants, no taller than your ankle, sprouted from cracks in the stone. They were fragile, but they clung fiercely to the earth, green sparks in a world of grey. Animals, too, survived, though fewer and humbler. Early synapsids, mammal-like creatures that once dominated the land, were now reduced to shadows of their former glory. Their numbers were few, their bodies smaller, their hold on life tenuous. Yet here and there, you could glimpse them moving cautiously across the open ground, searching for food among the dust. But it was the reptiles who moved most surely, as if the new silence belonged to them. Their scales glimmered faintly in the light, their bodies low and deliberate, their movements practiced in survival. Some were no larger than lizards today, darting into burrows or beneath stones at the slightest sound. Others stood taller, leaner, their long tails balancing as they strode across the landscape with quiet determination. This was not yet their world, not fully, not completely, but it was a world that was waiting, a stage swept bare, the ashes of the old swept aside, the air tinged with the promise of change. The great dying had burned away the forests, the reefs, the herds of great creatures that once ruled the Permian. But in its wake, it left something else, opportunity. And in the silence of that opportunity, the reptiles began their quiet claim. They did not roar yet, nor thunder across plains. They were not yet the titans of tomorrow, but they were present, steady, and unbroken. Among the ashes of the old world, they were the first sparks of what was to come. From the ruins of the Permian, those who remained did so not by strength alone, but by endurance. The survivors of the great dying carried with them no crowns, no thunder, no dominance, only the quiet resilience needed to live another day. And among them, the reptiles emerged as heirs to a broken, waiting world. They were not the most dazzling creatures of their time. Compared to the great amphibians of the past, they seemed modest, scaled beings with narrow snouts and lean frames. But modesty can be its own power. In a world stripped bare, survival favored the adaptable, the cautious, the creatures who could endure heat, dryness, and hunger. The reptiles carried within their very bodies the tools of persistence. Their scaly skin, unlike the soft hides of many who had perished, conserved water, shielding them from the desiccating breath of Pangaea's deserts. Their eggs, encased in protective shells, could be laid on land, far from the dangers of stagnant seas or drying rivers. Where amphibians needed water, reptiles could stride into barren places and make them their own. It was not just anatomy, but temperament. Reptiles were patient. They did not require vast herds of prey. They could wait, motionless, for the perfect moment to strike. They could eat sparingly, surviving where others starved. They could hide in cracks and burrows, shielded from storms and heat, and emerge when the world was quiet again. In these simple strategies lay the seeds of the empire. Across the landscapes of Pangaea, these small victories accumulated. On sun-baked stones, they basked, absorbing warmth into their blood. Along rivers, they hunted insects and fish, filling bellies with what little the waters offered. In conifer groves, they moved like shadows between roots, climbing, scurrying, watching. Other survivors remained too. Synapsids, with their warm-blooded potential, would one day give rise to mammals. Amphibians lingered in shrinking pools, clinging to damp edges of rivers. Insects, resilient as ever, buzzed across the land, weaving life back into silence. But reptiles, more than any others, fit perfectly into this new world. The age of reptiles would not come all at once. It would spread, scale by scale, step by step, across millions of years. Their inheritance was more than survival. It was the freedom to expand. The Great Dying had swept away rivals and toppled ecosystems, leaving behind vast, unclaimed spaces. Where once great predators ruled, now only dust and silence remained. Into that silence the reptiles crept, then strode, then claimed. And so, beneath the heat of the Triassic sun, the survivors began their slow conquest. They carried with them no legacy of grandeur, no memory of glory, only the inheritance of persistence. And sometimes, persistence is enough to change the fate of worlds. The sun of the Triassic beat down upon the Earth with a brilliance both unforgiving and life-giving. Its rays spilled across the endless expanse of Pangaea, where the land stretched unbroken for thousands of miles. Day after day, the sky shimmered with heat, and the ground cracked beneath its weight. It was a world of extremes, vast deserts where nothing seemed to move, jagged mountains where fire still hissed from vents, and river valleys where life clung desperately to each trickle of water. The heart of Pangaea was a furnace. Sand dunes rolled endlessly, shifting with every gust of wind. The air shimmered as though the land itself burned, mirages dancing on horizons that never drew closer. It was in this harshness that reptiles found their stage. They did not shy away from the heat, they embraced it. Their bodies absorbed the warmth, fueling their movements, their rhythms of waking and resting set to the rise and fall of the sun. From high ridges, the land appeared like a painting of golds and reds, streaked with black volcanic stone. Rivers cut through the deserts in narrow veins, their banks lined with scrubby plants, the only green in a sea of ochre. Where water gathered, so did life. Reptiles traced these lifelines, moving silently through dust and sand to find food and shelter. The mornings began in stillness. Before the sun crested the horizon, reptiles crept from their burrows, their scales cool and dark, their bodies sluggish until the first light kissed the stone. They basked upon flat rocks, turning slowly, letting warmth seep into their blood. One by one, they stirred, lifting heads, blinking eyes, tasting the air with forked tongues. The day belonged to them. As the sun climbed higher, the world shimmered. The heat was brutal, but it was also a protector, driving away the weaker and the fragile. Insects buzzed over dry ground, and reptiles snapped at them with quick, precise strikes. Larger forms stalked carefully along riverbanks, hunting smaller prey that strayed too far from shelter. Their shadows stretched long across the sand, sharp against the brilliance of the earth. The afternoons brought silence again. The heat became so intense that even reptiles sought shade, curling beneath rocks, sheltering in cracks, resting until the sky softened once more. In these hours, the land seemed empty, save for the hiss of wind moving sand from one dune to another. Yet beneath that stillness, life waited, patient and enduring. When evening came, the desert breathed again. Shadows grew long, and the sky shifted into deep oranges and purples. The reptiles emerged once more, scales glowing faintly in the fading light. Some hunted under the coolness of dusk, their movements quicker, more energetic, as the air lost its weight. Others returned to their basking stones, soaking up the last warmth of the day before retreating into burrows for the night. Above, the first stars appeared, piercing the vast, darkening sky. The Milky Way spilled across the heavens, a pale band stretching from horizon to horizon, unbroken by human lights, unspoiled by cities yet to come. Under that canopy, the reptiles endured, patient and unyielding. The harsh Triassic sun did not destroy them. It shaped them. In its brilliance, they found strength. In its extremes, they found opportunity. Where others faltered, reptiles thrived, their scales shimmering in defiance of a world still healing. This was their training ground, the furnace of Pangaea, a place where only the adaptable could endure. And from this crucible, The Age of Reptiles would continue to grow stronger day by day under the watchful, burning sun. In the grand silence that followed the Great Dying, it was not giants who first reclaimed the world, but the small. Tiny reptiles, no larger than your hand, scurried across rocks and through shadows. They did not shake the earth when they moved, nor cast long shadows across the sand. Instead, they lived in a quieter rhythm, one of patience, adaptation, and quiet persistence. In their diminutive frames, the earth found its first brushstrokes of renewal. Picture them in the morning, before the Triassic sun has fully risen. The ground is still cool, shadows stretched long across the plain. From narrow crevices, small shapes begin to emerge. Their scales glisten faintly in the pale light, patterns of green, bronze, and stone gray blending with the ground. They pause, motionless, their slender sides rising and falling as they breathe. Then slowly, they scuttle onto flat stones warmed by the first touch of sunlight, spreading their limbs to soak in its energy. They are living mirrors of their world, storing the warmth of the land in their blood, their tiny hearts beginning to quicken. Their world is not empty. To them, every pebble is a mountain, every patch of grass a forest, every dry creek bed a vast canyon. They move within this miniature landscape with confidence, navigating a universe of textures and shadows unseen by larger eyes. The silence of Pangaea becomes their canvas, and on it, they paint the beginnings of an empire. The art of survival. These small reptiles were masters of economy. They wasted nothing. Their movements were quick, precise, and deliberate, never stepped too far, never gestured too bold. They survived by knowing intimately the language of the land. A faint rustle in dry grass might mean food, an insect wandering too close. A sudden vibration in the soil could mean danger, the approach of a larger hunter. Their lives were not measured in grandeur, but in heartbeats, each moment a delicate calculation of risk and reward. Their diets were modest but sustaining. Insects buzzing through the heat of day, small amphibians lingering at shrinking pools, seeds carried by the wind, all became nourishment. Their teeth, sharp and efficient, snapped quickly, leaving no chance for escape. And yet, even in these humble meals, there was significance. In feeding on what others ignored, these reptiles carved a niche for themselves, ensuring survival in a world still rebuilding. Dreams in scales. Though they were small, their legacy was vast. Within their veins flowed lineages that would one day split and branch into astonishing forms. The towering sauropods, the armored stegosaurs, the swift raptors, the soaring pterosaurs. Each of these giants and marvels traced their ancestry back to these tiny, almost overlooked creatures. They were not aware of their destiny, of course. They did not dream of dominance. Their dreams were simpler: to find warmth, to find food, to see another dawn. And yet, in the simplicity of their survival lay the foundation for the greatest reign the earth had ever seen. Their very existence was a promise written in flesh and bone, a reminder that the grandest legacies often begin quietly, almost invisibly. The Hidden Kingdom. To walk among them would be to enter a secret world. Imagine lying on the ground, lowering your perspective until your eyes rest at their level. What seemed barren and lifeless from afar is suddenly alive with countless motions. Tiny feet scrabble over grains of sand. Small heads tilt curiously toward the sky. Shadows slip between blades of grass. Even the cracks in stone become busy passageways, leading into hidden burrows where entire families huddle in the cool earth. The air itself seems alive at this scale. You would hear the faint scrape of claws against rock, the soft snap of jaws closing around a cricket, the whisper of tails brushing against dry soil. These were the sounds of persistence, quiet, steady, and full of meaning. At night, when the desert cooled and the stars stretched across the heavens, these small reptiles ventured out once more. Their eyes caught the starlight, gleaming like sparks against the darkness. They moved with renewed energy, free from the punishing heat of the day. Some stalked insects are drawn to the glow of phosphorescent fungi. Others dug deeper into burrows, preparing for the next morning's light. Above them, the cosmos spread vast and eternal, but on the ground, their tiny lives carried the weight of continuity. It is easy, from the perspective of deep time, to overlook them. History often favors the grand, the towering forms, the thunderous steps, the creatures that reshape the earth with their size. But life does not begin with giants. It begins with survivors. It begins with the small ones who endure, who adapt, who make the barren soil livable again. In this way, the small reptiles of the Triassic were not merely inhabitants of their world, they were its foundation. Their survival stabilized ecosystems, their presence invited balance, and from their quiet persistence, the pathways opened for greater forms to come. The Age of Reptiles did not begin with a roar. It began with these miniature dreamers, their scales glinting in the sun, their movements delicate yet determined. They were the sparks of resilience glowing faintly against the ashes of the old world. One day, their descendants would grow into shadows that shook the ground, into wings that cut across the skies, into leviathans that ruled the seas. But here, in the dawn of their story, they were only small scales with big dreams, and that was enough. From the quiet movements of the small reptiles, a new lineage began to cast longer and longer shadows across the Triassic Earth. These were the Archosaurs, ruling reptiles, whose bloodlines would one day split into mighty rivers, crocodilians, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs themselves. In the early Triassic, they were still modest, their bodies lean and agile, their dominance not yet written in thunderous steps. But already the Earth trembled faintly with their promise. The form of a new power. Archosaurs were different. Their bodies told a story of potential. Strong hind limbs lifted them more upright than their sprawling ancestors, allowing quicker, more confident strides across uneven ground. Their jaws were longer, lined with sharp teeth built not just for snapping at insects, but for seizing larger prey. Their chests held deeper cavities, hinting at a stronger breath, a quicker metabolism, a new kind of vigor that separated them from other reptiles. In a world where survival often depended on patience and stillness, the Archosaurs were hunters of opportunity. They did not merely wait for the world to pass by, they pursued it. Their shadows stretched longer as they moved across the sands, and in those shadows lay the beginnings of dominance. The rivals that remained. But they were not alone. Other survivors, the synapsids, kin to the creatures that would one day become mammals, still lingered. Once, before the Great Dying, synapsids had ruled the land with toothy power and bulky might. Now they were diminished, smaller, their lineages reduced to scraps of what they had been. They lurked in burrows, hunted cautiously at night, their forms more furtive than commanding. When synapsids met Archosaurs, it was not a clash of titans, but a quiet contest, repeated again and again across the Triassic landscape. A small synapsid might creep from a hollow in search of insects, only to vanish under the sudden strike of an Archosaur jaw. Slowly, quietly, without fanfare, one lineage gave way to another. The shadows of the Archosaurs lengthened while the synapsids retreated further into obscurity. Hunters in the heat. By day, Archosaurs thrived under the merciless sun. Their scales gleamed like burnished copper as they moved with swift precision across baked earth. Along riverbanks, they lay in ambush, their long tails coiled, their bodies half hidden in reeds until a smaller reptile or amphibian strayed too close. In dry gullies, they chased prey with bursts of speed, their claws kicking up dust in golden clouds. They were not yet giants, but even in their smaller forms, they carried an aura of authority. Other creatures moved carefully when Archosaurs prowled. The rhythm of insects changed. The chatter of smaller reptiles quieted. Their presence altered the very energy of the land. Whispers of their future. Looking at them, one might not yet see the towering dinosaurs of tomorrow, but the blueprint was there, in the tilt of their hips, the confidence of their stride, the efficiency of their lungs. They were built not just to survive, but to expand. Their lineage held within it the spark of thunder, the weight of herds that would one day sweep across plains, the roar of predators that would shake forests. At night, their shadows stretched in silver across the desert floor, illuminated by the stars. Small they might be, but their presence lingered like an omen, a foreshadowing written in muscle and bone. The age of scales deepens. The reptiles had already begun to claim the earth, but within the reptilian realm, it was the Archosaurs who would shape destiny. They were not content with small scales and cautious lives. They were rulers in waiting, their blood carrying the echo of creatures yet unborn. In the Triassic dusk, as the wind moved dust across the dunes and the sky deepened into violet, their silhouettes traced the horizon. The world had given them silence, and they filled it with movement. The stage, once swept clean by extinction, now belonged to them. The shadows of the Archosaurs were growing longer, and soon they would no longer be shadows. They would become the very form of power itself. The heart of Pangaea was a desert without end. Sand stretched for hundreds upon hundreds of miles, rolling in golden waves under sky that burned without mercy. The air shimmered with heat, bending horizons into mirages of rivers and lakes that dissolved as one drew closer. Few creatures dared to cross these expanses, for the desert was not a place of generosity, but of trial. Yet here too, the reptiles wandered, quiet, enduring, and unafraid of the furnace. A land of extremes. The desert was alive with silence. Winds scraped across dunes, carrying whispers of shifting grains. The ground cracked into mosaics of pale stone, and dry gullies wound like scars across the earth. By day, the heat was blinding, pressing down like a weight. By night, the cold arrived swiftly, the stars sharp and unblinking in the vast heavens. Survival here demanded more than strength. It demanded adaptability, patience, and resilience, traits the reptiles carried in abundance. The rhythm of the day. At dawn, the desert stirred. The first rays of sunlight painted the dunes in shades of rose and amber. From burrows dug deep into the sand, reptiles emerged cautiously. Their scales glowed in the early light, still cool from the night, their movements slow and deliberate. They climbed onto rocks, spreading their limbs wide, absorbing warmth until the stiffness of night melted away. Soon they moved with fluidity again, their eyes sharp, their tongues flickering to taste the air. By midday, the desert grew merciless. The sun stood directly overhead, casting shadows that shrank into narrow outlines beneath stones and shrubs. Most life retreated then, reptiles slipping back into burrows, coiling beneath rocks, or pressing themselves against shaded cliff faces. Only the most determined remained active, their bodies shimmering with heat, their survival a testament to endurance. As evening fell, the desert came alive once more. Temperatures dropped, and the sands glowed orange beneath the sinking sun. Reptiles emerged again, quicker now, their bodies filled with the energy of cooling air. They prowled across dunes, their tails carving lines into the sand, their movements etched against the twilight. Under the rising moon, the desert was transformed into a kingdom of motion, countless small hunters and wanderers tracing paths across the once still land. Survival in scarcity. Water was scarce, but where it gathered, in hidden springs, shallow oases, or temporary pools after storms, life clustered. Conifers and cycads grew in stubborn clusters, their roots reaching deep for unseen reserves. Around them, reptiles prowled, small ones darting among roots, larger forms watching from the edges. Insects buzzed, amphibians lingered, and archosaurs crept with predatory patience, knowing the desert gathered its children in these rare sanctuaries. Food was never plentiful, but scarcity taught efficiency. Reptiles wasted nothing. A beetle was a feast. A fallen seed was sustenance. And when storms rolled across the desert, bringing sudden rain, the reptiles moved quickly, seizing the brief abundance before the sun returned to claim it again. Masters of adaptation. Unlike many creatures before them, reptiles were not bound to rivers or shaded forests. Their dry, scaly skin shielded them from desiccation. Their shelled eggs freed them from dependence on water for reproduction. They carried their survival with them, built into their very bodies, making deserts not barriers but frontiers. Here in this furnace, their adaptability shone brightest. Some reptiles hunted with sudden bursts of speed, leaping from ambush beneath sand. Others foraged carefully, noses pressed to the ground as they searched for seeds and insects. Even the smallest among them left trails of possibility across dunes that had once been lifeless. The poetics of the desert. At night, when the desert cooled, the landscape glowed beneath the stars. Dunes cast long, rippling shadows. The Milky Way stretched like a river of pale light across the heavens. Reptiles wandered freely then, their scales reflecting silver in the starlight. Their movements were silent, but their presence filled the land with a rhythm, a pulse of persistence that the desert could not erase. To watch them was to witness a paradox, fragility and strength woven together. Small bodies against an endless desert, yet those bodies endured, step after step, generation after generation. They were wanderers not lost, but thriving, carrying with them the quiet confidence of creatures who had outlasted ruin and found home even in the harshest of lands. The desert was no longer empty. It was alive with the wanderers of scale and bone, creatures who claimed silence as their own. From one oasis to another, from burrow to dune, they spread across the furnace of Pangaea. The desert, once a symbol of devastation, had become their proving ground. And as they wandered, their story deepened, a story not only of survival, but of preparation. For in the furnace of sand and stone, the reptiles were being forged into rulers. Where the deserts of Pangaea stretched like an endless sea of sand and stone, rivers carved through them like living veins. They wound their way across the supercontinent, shimmering ribbons of silver under the unforgiving sun, carrying the promise of life to all who drew near. To the reptiles, these rivers were more than water. They were sanctuaries, hunting grounds, and pathways of survival. The gift of flowing water. The rivers began in mountains where snowmelt and rains pooled together, tumbling down slopes in foaming torrents. As they descended into valleys, they slowed, spreading into wide, meandering channels. Along their banks, green flourished. Conifers leaned toward the water, their roots gripping tightly against floods. Ferns unfurled in dense mats, their fronds waving like delicate banners in the humid air. Here, the harsh dryness of the desert gave way to oases of abundance. To the reptiles, these places were havens. Along shaded banks, they found food and shelter. In shallows, they cooled their bodies, slipping quietly into the water to hide from the heat of the day. Eggs were laid in damp soil, safe from the relentless sun. The rivers did not just give life, they gathered it, drawing insects, amphibians, fish, and reptiles alike into a delicate dance of survival. Hunters of the banks. Archosaurs and their kin prowled these fertile edges with patience. Long jaws hovered just above the waterline, waiting for a careless fish or amphibian to wander too close. Their scales gleamed with dampness, their eyes unblinking as they fixed on ripples. When the moment came, they struck with terrifying speed, jaws snapping shut in a spray of water and dust. Smaller reptiles scurried across the roots of trees, their quick feet tapping over mud as they hunted insects. Some clung to low branches, watching with gleaming eyes for the flicker of wings or the wriggle of prey. Every level of the riverbank was alive with reptilian presence, from the ground to the treetops, each niche filled with determination. The pulse of the waters. At night the rivers transformed. The moon shimmered on the surface, turning the waters to liquid silver. The sounds of the desert faded into silence, but along the rivers life hummed. Frogs croaked from the shadows. Insects buzzed above the water, their wings glowing faintly in the pale light. Reptiles stirred once more, their eyes catching the reflections of stars. They hunted in the cool night air, their bodies lighter, their steps quicker. The river was their ally, a constant presence, a flowing pulse that beat through the heart of the land. The waters, ever moving, carried stories downstream, seeds from far-off mountains, fragments of leaves from distant forests, the echoes of storms that rumbled over valleys. To the reptiles, this constant motion meant opportunity. New food drifted in with every flow. New shelters opened as banks eroded and reshaped. The rivers were not fixed. They were alive, always shifting, always giving. The web of connection. The reptiles that lingered along rivers did not live in isolation. Their presence wove them into a larger web. Fish swam in shallows, insects danced above, amphibians croaked in mud. Birds had not yet claimed the skies, but the first whispers of their ancestry stirred in small, feathered forms nearby. The reptiles were at the center of it all, hunters, scavengers, foragers, guardians of eggs buried in moist soil. To the rivers came not just food and water, but life's rhythm itself. They provided cycles of flood and drought, feast and famine, testing those who lived nearby. Yet reptiles thrived in the uncertainty, their patience and adaptability once again proving their strength. The pathways of the future. Rivers were not only sanctuaries but highways. They connected deserts to forests, valleys to coasts. Following their curves, reptiles spread farther and farther, expanding their range across the vastness of Pangaea. They carried with them not only survival, but the seeds of change, each journey adding to the slow, steady march of evolution. Where the desert was a crucible, the rivers were lifeblood. They nourished the weary, gathered the scattered, and offered a promise of renewal. In the Triassic world, where silence still lingered from extinction, the rivers whispered softly, life continues and life expands. And in their flowing embrace, reptiles found not only survival, but the foundation of their reign. The oceans, too, had felt the silence of extinction. Once vibrant reefs lay bare, their corals bleached and broken, their colors drained into pale skeletons scattered by waves. Schools of fish were fewer, their movements tentative, as though even they feared the emptiness that had swallowed so much life. For millions of years, the seas had been graveyards. But as the Triassic unfolded, the waters began to stir once more, and reptiles were the ones who reclaimed them. The first return to the deep. From the shorelines of Pangaea, reptiles ventured back into the waves, their bodies reshaped by the demands of water. Some were slender, streamlined, their limbs transformed into powerful flippers. Others stretched long and serpentine, winding through the currents with graceful, predatory coils. They had not forgotten the land, but the ocean called to them, and they answered with innovation. The Ichthyosaurs were among the first pioneers. With sleek, dolphin-like bodies and eyes large enough to drink in the dim light of the depths, they cut through the seas with speed and confidence. Their jaws snapped shut on fleeing fish, scattering schools like silver rain beneath the surface. Their silhouettes, gliding against shafts of sunlight, seemed alien yet familiar, reptiles remade into swift hunters of the deep. The lords of shallow seas. Closer to shore, other reptiles adapted in different ways. Some grew paddle-like limbs and long necks, weaving gracefully among lagoons and tidal flats. They lurked in shallows, their heads rising like serpents from the water to strike at unsuspecting prey. The seas near river mouths and coastal bays teemed with these new predators, their bodies carving ripples across calm waters. Their presence brought a new energy to the coastlines. No longer empty, the waters throbbed with the rhythm of pursuit and escape. Fish swam faster, insects hovered cautiously over shallows, and amphibians avoided the edges of pools where shadows might strike. The reptiles had made the oceans theirs again, and everything else adapted in response. The beauty of motion. To watch these creatures swim was to witness elegance forged by survival. Ichthyosaurs arced from the surface, spraying water in glittering arcs before slipping back into the depths. Long-necked plesiosaurs twisted gracefully through kelp and algae, their movements as fluid as the currents themselves. Even the smaller reptilian swimmers, cousins of lizards and crocodiles, glided with astonishing ease, their tails flicking side to side in hypnotic rhythm. The sea was no longer a place of stillness. It was alive again, alive with the shadows of reptilian hunters reclaiming what had been lost. Nights of silver seas. Under the moon, the oceans glowed with pale light. Waves broke softly against cliffs, and phosphorescent plankton shimmered in the wake of reptilian swimmers. Each movement lit the water in trails of green and blue, as though the stars themselves had spilled into the sea. At the surface, the air was heavy with salt and the steady hush of waves. Beneath, silence reigned except for the sudden snap of jaws, the rush of bubbles, the swift escape of prey. Eyes as wide as lanterns glowed faintly in the dark, watching, hunting, surviving. The oceans had been emptied once, but now they were being filled again, not with the same creatures as before, but with new rulers forged in scale and bone. The rain expands. The reptiles no longer belonged only to deserts, rivers, or forests. They had claimed the seas as well. From the shorelines to the open depths, they traced their dominion across blue horizons, their forms multiplying, diversifying, spreading. The ocean, once the emptiest of all realms after the Great Dying, now pulsed with reptilian power. And as their reign spread beneath the waves, the balance of the world shifted once more. The Age of Reptiles was no longer bound to the land. It had flowed outward, carried on the tides, whispered by waves, inscribed in the foam of ancient seas. Not all seas were endless depths. Along the edges of Pangaea's vast coastlines, where rivers spilled into oceans and tides crept inland, lagoons stretched like sheltered mirrors of blue and green. They were places of calm, shallow, sun-warmed pools cut off from the roar of the open sea. In these waters, life blossomed again, and reptiles rose as their undisputed rulers. The shallows awaken. The lagoons glittered in the sun, their surfaces broken by reeds, algae, and the winding paths of fish. Salt mingled with fresh water where rivers kissed the sea, creating brackish worlds teeming with possibilities. The silence of extinction still lingered in many places, but here, in these sheltered havens, ecosystems stitched themselves back together thread by thread. Amphibians clung to muddy edges, insects danced above the rippling surface, fish darted in schools of silver light, hiding among the roots of aquatic plants. Into this fragile harmony came the reptiles, drawn by abundance, their forms sleek and purposeful. Predators of still waters. Some reptiles lay in wait beneath the water's surface, their nostrils barely breaking the air. With sudden lunges, they erupted in sprays of foam, jaws snapping around startled prey. Others glided silently, long necks weaving like serpents, their heads dipping down to seize fish with lightning precision. Archosaurs prowled the edges, their claws sinking into wet mud, their reflections rippling on the lagoon's surface. They moved with patience, watching for smaller reptiles, amphibians, or insects to stray too far from shelter. Even the smallest pools became arenas of survival, where still waters masked sudden violence. The rhythm of tides. The lagoons shifted with the pull of the tides. At high water they swelled, their edges spilling into reeds and grasses, carrying in new fish and drifting plants. At low tide, they shrank back, exposing muddy flats alive with scuttling crustaceans and burrowing worms. Reptiles learned these rhythms well, timing their hunts to the movements of the moon and sea. Some slithered through mud flats, leaving winding trails that glistened under starlight. Others buried themselves in soft silt, their bodies hidden, their eyes fixed upward until prey drew near. The tide was not just a cycle, it was a drumbeat that orchestrated life in the lagoons, and reptiles moved to its music with instinctive grace. A kingdom of reflection. At dusk, the lagoons became mirrors. The sky, painted in hues of gold and violet, lay reflected in still waters. The silhouettes of reptiles traced long shadows across the glowing surface, their movements elegant and ghostly. Frogs croaked from the banks, insects flitted in swarms that shimmered like smoke, and reptiles cut silent ripples as they swam, each one a dark stroke across the canvas of reflected sky. The air smelled of salt and life, of algae, wet stone, and the musk of reptiles lingering in the twilight. The lagoons, though modest in size, felt vast in their richness. They were cradles of survival, sanctuaries where the reptiles thrived and multiplied. The lords of calm waters. To call them lords was not to crown them in grandeur, but to recognize their mastery of this realm. In lagoons, they reign not by thunderous size, but by precision, by patience, by sheer adaptability. They made the lagoons their own, shaping the fragile ecosystems into places where reptiles were always at the center. From these calm, reflective waters, their reign spread outward, from rivers to lagoons, from lagoons to seas, from seas back to land. The reptiles were no longer wanderers or survivors. They were becoming rulers, one habitat at a time. The lagoons shimmered beneath the moonlight, and in their mirrored depths, the future of reptiles was written. Beyond the deserts, rivers, and lagoons, great forests stretched across Pangaea, not lush jungles filled with flowering plants as we know today, but ancient woodlands of conifers. Their tall trunks rose like pillars into the sky, their branches crowned with spires of green needles that whispered together in the wind. These were the forests of the Triassic, vast, solemn, and timeless. And within their shade, reptiles found yet another realm to call their own. The dominion of conifers. The air within these forests was thick with resin, sharp and fragrant. Sap oozed from wounded bark, glistening like amber in the sunlight. Fallen needles blanketed the ground in soft carpets of gold and green, muffling the footsteps of creatures moving below. Unlike the fragile ferns of earlier ages, conifers were hardy. They rose high and proud, their roots digging deep, their branches spreading wide. For the reptiles, these forests were havens. The canopy cast cool shadows against the brutal heat of the Triassic sun. Pools of shade became shelters, roots became fortresses, and branches offered perches for the nimble and the small. The forests were not gentle, but they were alive, and within their labyrinth of trunks and needles, reptiles thrived. Hunters among the trees. Predatory reptiles prowled the forest floor, their scales blending with shadows. They moved in silence, their eyes glinting through shafts of golden light that pierced the canopy. When prey stirred, an insect, an amphibian, a smaller reptile, they struck with sudden precision, jaws closing in an instant. Other reptiles moved more quietly still, scuttling up tree trunks, their claws gripping bark as they ascended toward the branches. There, among cones and needles, they found insects to feast upon or simply basked in sunlight where it filtered through. The forest was not ruled by one kind of reptile, but by many, each carving a niche in the spires of green. The sounds of the needlewoods. The forests were never truly silent. Insects droned in the undergrowth, their wings buzzing in low hums. Resin dripped from branches with soft taps, hardening into jewels of amber on the forest floor. Lizards scuttled across fallen needles with faint rustles, their tails leaving delicate trails in the dust. When storms swept through, the trees groaned together, bending in chorus beneath the weight of the wind. To wander among these woods was to enter a cathedral of time. The trees towered like columns, the canopy arched high like a roof, and the reptiles moved through it as priests of survival, quiet and unyielding. Cycles of shade and sunlight. The forests carried their own rhythms. At dawn, shafts of sunlight filtered through the branches, painting the ground in stripes of gold. Reptiles emerged then, basking on fallen logs, warming their blood for the day ahead. By midday, the canopy's thick shade cooled the earth, offering respite from the desert heat beyond the forest's edge. And at dusk, the woods came alive again, insects swarmed in clouds, frogs croaked from hidden ponds, and reptiles stirred to hunt under the growing darkness. At night, the forest floor glowed with faint lights, bioluminescent fungi clinging to decayed wood, insects flickering like sparks in the dark. Reptiles slithered through the shadows, their eyes glimmering with reflected starlight, their movements hidden but constant. The forest as a forge. These conifer woods were more than homes, they were proving grounds. They tested the reptiles in new ways. The challenge of climbing, the art of ambush among shadows, the patience of waiting in silence for prey. The forests forged diversity, shaping lineages that would one day branch into forms unimaginable. And as the needles whispered overhead, the reptiles below grew stronger, bolder, more varied. They were no longer creatures of just desert and lagoon. They had entered the forest, and in its solemn halls, they claimed yet another dominion. The forests of needles stretched endlessly, their crowns brushing the sky, their roots clutching the earth. And beneath them, the reptiles moved like whispers in shadow, quiet but unstoppable. The Age of Reptiles was not only spreading across the land, it was deepening, rooting itself in every realm. The Triassic world was not only a stage for survival, it was a theater of shadows, for where prey gathered, predators followed. And the reptiles, honed by the trials of desert, river, lagoon, and forest, became masters of silent pursuit. Their hunts were not loud, not chaotic, but patient, deliberate, and filled with tension. They were predators cloaked in silence, shadows that turned stillness into power. The language of stillness. Unlike the thunderous chases of later ages, the hunts of the Triassic were quiet dances. A predator did not need to rush when patience would do. Reptiles froze for long stretches, their bodies blending with stone or shadow, every movement calculated, every breath controlled. The world itself seemed to hold still with them, waiting for the sudden strike that would shatter the calm. On the desert floor, Archosaurs crouched low against dunes, their outlines blurred in the shifting sand. Along riverbanks, they hid among reeds, nostrils just above the waterline, eyes fixed on ripples that betrayed prey. In the forests, shadows deepened between trunks, and hunters moved silently through fallen needles, their scales catching only the faintest glints of light. Eyes that never blinked. The eyes of these predators were instruments of patience. Wide, unblinking, unyielding, they followed even the smallest flickers of motion. A beetle's crawl across a stone, a frog's jump into shallow water, the nervous twitch of a smaller reptile, nothing escaped their gaze. For prey, it was not only jaws they feared, but the sensation of being watched. Imagine being a small creature in the Triassic woods, pausing to drink from a pool. The forest seems quiet, the air heavy with resin and shadow, and yet somewhere nearby, eyes are fixed upon you, cold, steady, patient. You cannot see them, but they see you. The silence is not safe. It is a trap. The strike. When the moment came, silence broke like glass. A burst of speed, claws flashing, jaws snapping. The strike was sudden and absolute. Prey had little chance once within reach. The hunt was not messy or prolonged. It was efficient, an end delivered in the space of a heartbeat. Dust rose briefly, water splashed, needles scattered, then silence returned, deeper than before. The predator, victorious, fed quickly, then vanished once more into stillness. The forest, the desert, the river, all resumed their quiet rhythms as though nothing had happened. But the memory of the strike lingered, woven into the air itself. The atmosphere of fear. The Triassic world lived under the weight of this silence. Prey moved cautiously, listening for the absence of sound as much as its presence. An insect's song might mean safety, its sudden hush might mean a predator nearby. Even the wind seemed complicit, carrying the faintest sense of scaled hunters across the land. It was a world where fear was constant, woven into the fabric of existence. But this fear was not chaos. It was order, a balance of stillness and motion, of prey and predator, of silence and strike. The predator's legacy. In these early hunters lay the blueprint of future terrors. Their patience, their silence, their efficiency, all would echo in the jaws of dinosaurs yet to come, in the shadows of pterosaurs circling above, in the coils of sea reptiles hunting beneath waves. The silence of the Triassic was not emptiness. It was rehearsal, the slow, deliberate shaping of predators who would one day rule the world. Beneath the burning sun, along rivers and forests, in lagoons and deserts, the predators moved without sound. They were the breath of stillness, the pause before motion, the silence that taught the world to listen. And as they hunted, the Age of Reptiles deepened its hold, one patient, perfect strike at a time. For millions of years after the Great Dying, the reptiles of the Triassic world remained modest, small hunters, silent stalkers, wanderers of desert and forest. But slowly, steadily, evolution sculpted them into something new. From the patience of the small and the silence of predators, size began to rise. Shapes lengthened, limbs strengthened, bodies grew heavier, and shadows stretched wider. The first great titans of the reptilian age were awakening. The gift of size. There is power in being small, in hiding, in vanishing when danger draws near. But there is also power in being large, in standing tall, in moving across the land without fear. The Triassic world tested both paths, and from its trials, some reptiles discovered that size itself was a weapon. On the open plains of Pangaea, herds of plant-eating reptiles began to grow into creatures of bulk and presence. Their bodies stretched into lengths that dwarfed smaller hunters. Thick legs carried their weight across grassless expanses, while long necks allowed them to browse conifer branches high above the reach of rivals. Their footsteps left impressions deep in the soil, marks that would linger until the next rains filled them with water. Where once the land was silent, now the ground seemed to hum faintly with their presence. Each step was a reminder that the reptiles had not only survived, they were beginning to dominate. Shapes of the early giants. These first titans did not yet resemble the iconic dinosaurs of later ages, but their forms carried hints of what was to come. Some stretched long and lean, their tails trailing like whips behind them. Others grew barrel-chested, with massive ribs and deep bodies built for digesting tough vegetation. Their teeth were blunt but efficient, stripping needles and leaves from branches with steady persistence. Predators circled them, but the balance of power was shifting. A small reptile might flee at the sight of danger, but a giant could stand its ground. Even if attacked, its sheer bulk could scatter would-be hunters, forcing them to retreat in search of easier prey. The titans carried themselves with an aura of inevitability. They did not rush, they did not hide. They moved as if the land belonged to them, and in time it would. The landscape of giants. Imagine standing in a Triassic clearing, the sun pouring golden light through gaps in the conifer canopy. From the shadows, a massive form steps into view, scales glinting in bronze and green. Its neck sways like the trunk of a tree as it pulls needles from high branches. Behind it, others emerge, a slow-moving herd, their movements steady and unhurried, their footsteps muffled by carpets of fallen needles. The forest seems to bow before them, the ground trembling faintly under their weight. Birds had not yet taken to the skis, Mammals were still tiny and furtive, but here, among these towering reptiles, a new rhythm of life was beginning. They were no longer survivors in silence. They were builders of presence, living monuments to resilience. Nightfall among the Titans. At dusk, the giants settled together, their massive bodies casting long shadows across the land. In the stillness of evening, they moved less, chewing steadily, tails swaying idly as insects hummed in the cooling air. Their eyes reflected the first stars, glimmering like lanterns in the darkness. Around them, smaller reptiles scurried in cautious paths, taking advantage of their protection. Few predators dared approach the herd once night fell, their sheer bulk was shield enough. The air carried their scent, musky, earthy, mixed with the resin of conifer forests. The sounds of their breathing were heavy and rhythmic, a deep chorus beneath the canopy. The night belonged to them as much as the day. The beginning of majesty. These early titans were not yet the sauropods that would one day dominate the Jurassic, but they were the first echoes of that majesty. They proved that reptiles could be more than survivors, more than hunters. They could be giants, shaping the land simply by existing upon it. Their presence was both a warning and a promise. The Age of Reptiles was not only about cunning predators or adaptable wanderers. It was about scale, about the possibility of life stretching itself to sizes unimaginable, filling the earth with forms that defied the silence of extinction. The first titans walked slowly, but their steps carried the weight of destiny. Each one was a reminder that the Age of Reptiles had only just begun, and that the world was preparing to echo with the thunder of giants. When the sun sank beyond the horizon and the deserts cooled, when rivers stilled into glass and forests hushed, the Triassic world transformed. Night draped itself over Pangaea, a vast velvet curtain stitched with stars. In this quiet, under the shimmer of the cosmos, the reptiles stirred once more, not as titans thundering across the land, but as quiet wanderers moving beneath the eternal sky. The canopy of eternity. The night sky of the Triassic was a vision unmarred by human lights. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens in a river of silver fire, each star sharp and unwavering. Constellations that would one day be named by distant civilizations already glimmered in the void, ancient and eternal. Shooting stars carved fleeting lines of brilliance, and the moon, pale and vast, spilled its reflection across rivers, lagoons, and the calm edges of the sea. On the desert floor, reptiles lay sprawled on cooling stones, their bodies releasing the heat of day. Their scales caught the moonlight, shimmering faintly as though each carried a fragment of the night sky upon their backs. Small hunters slipped between rocks, their eyes glowing like twin embers. Larger forms moved slowly, their silhouettes cutting dark shapes across the silver-lit sands. The language of night. The Triassic world spoke differently after dusk. Frogs called from pools with deep, throaty notes. Insects buzzed in shimmering clouds, their wings humming like distant chords. The rustle of leaves betrayed the movement of lizards hunting in the undergrowth. Each sound, soft and subtle, merged into a symphony of persistence, life finding its rhythm in the hours when the sun's tyranny relented. Predators, too, came alive in the dark. Eyes glimmered in the shadows of forests, fixed on the flicker of prey. Along riverbanks, Archosaurs crouched silently, their reflections rippling on moonlit water. The air grew cooler, carrying scents more keenly, guiding hunters through invisible trails. The darkness was not emptiness, it was an opportunity. The small and the silent. For the smaller reptiles, night was a reprieve. No longer pressed into stillness by the day's oppressive heat, they darted freely across the land. Tiny claws tapped over fallen needles, over smooth stones, over cracked earth still radiating warmth. Their bodies glowed faintly under starlight, their shadows long and delicate. They hunted insects, nibbled on seeds, and scurried back into burrows, each small movement a stitch in the fabric of survival. Yet even in these miniature lives, there was poetry. Imagine lying in the forest at night, watching them climb tree trunks under the glimmer of the stars. They pause, turning their heads upward, eyes wide as if reflecting the heavens themselves. In those quiet moments, the boundary between earth and sky feels blurred, scales below, stars above, both glittering with the same quiet persistence. The giants under moonlight. The first titans, too, bore the weight of night. Their massive forms, almost invisible in shadow, moved like ghosts between conifer trunks. The ground trembled faintly beneath their steps, though the sound was softened by layers of fallen needles. Their necks swayed like living towers, reaching for branches even in darkness. Their eyes, large and luminous, caught moonlight and returned it in pale gleams, like lanterns in the dark. Predators watched them but rarely attacked. The giants were too vast, too formidable, and so they passed through the night with calm authority, their presence a reminder that the age of reptiles was no longer measured only in silence and shadows, but in the immensity of bodies that could not be ignored. Stars reflected in scales. By midnight, when the world was at its darkest, reptiles of every kind shared the same sky. From deserts to lagoons, from rivers to forests, they moved beneath constellations that had seen countless ages and would see countless more. The stars reflected in their scales, turning them into fragments of the cosmos walking upon the earth. In their patience, in their silence, in their survival, they mirrored the stars themselves, enduring, ancient, constant. The Triassic night was not lonely. It was alive with quiet movement, with scales against stone, with breath beneath the endless canopy of light. The promise of night. Night carried with it a sense of promise. It reminded the reptiles that the world was vast, that the silence of extinction had been broken, and that they now belonged to an earth that stretched not only across land and sea, but beneath the infinite heavens. Beneath the stars, the age of reptiles did not feel small. It felt eternal. Their reign had only just begun, yet already it was written in the rhythm of the cosmos, scales below, stars above, both glimmering in the vast story of time. The Triassic world was not kind. Heat scorched the deserts, storms tore across valleys, rivers swelled and vanished, forests burned, and seas shifted with the pull of the earth itself. Yet in the face of all this, reptiles endured. Their story was not simply one of dominance, but of persistence, of survival in a world that demanded patience and adaptability. And in that persistence, they wove quiet songs of endurance, each scale and heartbeat a verse in a melody that carried across time. The harsh chorus of the land. The land itself seemed to sing in extremes. The hiss of desert winds, the crack of lightning splitting mountains, the groan of trees bending beneath storms, all were part of the world's voice. The reptiles lived within this chorus, adding their own notes, the scrape of claws on stone, the snap of jaws in pursuit, the soft rustle of scales through grass. To survive here was to listen, to learn, to adapt. When rivers dried, reptiles wandered further. When storms flooded valleys, they clung to higher ground. When prey grew scarce, they changed their diets, scavenging, nibbling, and waiting. Each challenge tested them, but each one also forged resilience. The quiet power of adaptation. Other creatures, too rigid in their needs, vanished. Amphibians still lingered but struggled in the droughts, tied to waters that often failed them. Synapsids shrank further into obscurity, their dominance a fading memory. But reptiles, with their water-conserving skins, their shelled eggs, their efficient lungs, carried on. Some grew larger to withstand scarcity, their bulk storing strength for leaner days. Others remained small, darting quickly between shadows, their lives brief but successful. Adaptation was not a single path, but 1,000, each shaped by necessity, each carved into the bones of the survivors. The Song of Patience. Imagine a reptile resting motionless on a sun-warmed stone, its body still for hours as it waits. Its eyes half-closed, its breath shallow, it seems almost part of the rock itself. Yet when an insect strays too close, or a smaller lizard hesitates within reach, it strikes, quick, efficient, final. This patience was a song of survival, to endure without wasting energy, to act only when the world offered opportunity. The patience of reptiles was not empty waiting. It was listening to the rhythms of earth and sky, aligning themselves with the patterns of heat and shadow, knowing when to move and when to remain still. In silence, they thrived. Songs of the Giants. The first titans, too, carried their own survival songs. Their vast bodies required endless foraging, yet they moved slowly, deliberately, never exhausting themselves in frantic chases. They consumed what the forests offered, turning needles into strength, size into safety. Their song was one of endurance, of moving with the land's pace, unhurried, unshaken. When storms raged, they stood tall, weathering the winds. When predators lurked, they gathered in groups, their numbers and bulk a fortress. Their very presence was a hymn to persistence, a chorus of footsteps echoing through the forests of needles. The poetry of hardship. Hardship was not an obstacle but a teacher. Each drought, each storm, each famine pressed the reptiles further into forms that fit the world. Their scales thickened, their teeth sharpened, their lungs strengthened, their instincts honed. Survival was not only about living another day, but about changing with each trial, shaping themselves for futures still unseen. Their songs were not loud, not sung in voices we could hear. They were written in footprints pressed into ancient soil, in bones fossilized beneath stone, in the enduring rhythm of life that refused to yield. The chorus of continuity. Together these songs wove into a chorus, the desert wanderer waiting for nightfall, the river hunter lurking in reeds, the lagoon predator gliding in silence, the forest giant pulling branches from trees. Each note was different, but together they formed the music of survival, a music that rose from the ashes of extinction and carried the world into its next great age. The Triassic was not gentle, but the reptiles did not need gentleness. They needed only the chance to endure, to adapt, to persist. And in doing so, they composed the greatest song of all, the song of survival that would echo for more than 150 million years, through deserts and seas, forests and skies. The Age of Reptiles was not a single melody, but a symphony of persistence, carried on scales beneath sun and stars alike. Pangaea was not only a land of deserts, rivers, forests and seas. It was a restless continent, stitched together by fire, split by stone, its heart beating with tectonic power. Beneath the feet of reptiles, the earth itself groaned and shifted, shaping valleys, raising mountains, and birthing volcanoes that painted the skies red. The Age of Reptiles was not lived upon a still stage, it was performed upon a world in constant upheaval. The furnace beneath the land. Deep under Pangaea, molten rock churned, restless and unquiet. Pressure built in silence, until one day, without warning, fire split the earth. Volcanoes erupted, belching clouds of ash into the sky. Rivers of lava spilled across plains, glowing orange and gold against the dark. The air grew heavy with heat and sulfur, and storms formed where ash met clouds, lightning lashing down in furious streaks. The reptiles endured it all. Where forests burned, they moved on. Where rivers boiled away, they found new valleys. Fire was not the end, it was only another trial. Mountains like sleeping titans. The movements of the earth raised mountains that towered above the plains. Their jagged peaks caught the first light of dawn, glowing crimson as the sun spilled across them. Snow dusted their crowns even as deserts baked below, creating sharp contrasts of ice and fire. The reptiles navigated these ranges, creeping through rocky passes, nesting in sheltered slopes, their claws finding purchase where few others could climb. Storms gathered often around these heights, rolling downward into valleys. Rains fell hard, cutting gullies into stone, filling rivers that nourished reptiles far below. The mountains were not obstacles, they were engines of change, shaping the land and its rhythms. Ash and renewal. When volcanoes erupted, entire landscapes could be buried in ash within days. Forests of conifers stood silent, their needles turned gray beneath the heavy fall. Rivers clogged with silt and stone, seas darkened with debris. Yet even in devastation, the cycle of renewal began. Ash enriched the soil, and in time, plants grew back greener, stronger, thicker. And where plants returned, reptiles followed, patient as always, reclaiming new ground as though nothing had been lost. The reptiles among fire. Archosaurs and their kin prowled the edges of lava flows, their scales glistening in the ruddy light. Small reptiles scurried over still warm stones, seeking insects and prey driven out by fire. Larger herbivores moved cautiously through valleys blanketed in new growth after eruptions, their jaws grinding leaves that rose from once barren ground. The reptiles lived not in fear of the earth's fire, but in rhythm with it. They adapted to its destruction, folding its chaos into their survival songs. The eternal stone. Even as the land shifted, there was stability in stone. Canyons carved by water revealed layers of ancient history, colored bands telling stories of worlds long gone. Reptiles basked on cliffs, their scales warmed by the timeless sun, as though to anchor themselves in the permanence of rock. The ground beneath them moved, yes, but it also endured. Fire could sweep the surface, but stone remained. And in this paradox of change and endurance, reptiles thrived. The continent of Pangaea was alive, breathing fire and stone, reshaping itself with every passing age. And upon it, the reptiles moved steadily forward. They were not shaken by earthquakes or daunted by eruptions. They adapted, survived, and spread. In this restless land, they found not chaos but opportunity. And as Pangaea shifted beneath their feet, so too did their destiny, toward dominion, toward diversity, toward the thunderous glory of ages yet to come. The Age of Reptiles was not an age given freely. It was claimed through rivalry, through the slow and quiet contest of bloodlines. The Triassic world did not belong to reptiles alone, not yet. It was shared, contested, fought over by other survivors of the Great Dying. Synapsids, the distant kin of future mammals, still lingered. Amphibians clung stubbornly to rivers and wetlands. Insects swarmed in endless numbers, shaping the diets of many. And among these, reptiles rose, challenged, resisted, but never defeated. The synapsid shadows. Once before the Great Dying, synapsids had been the lords of land. They were the predators, the grazers, the dominant bloodline that filled the Permian with tooth and claw. But after the cataclysm, they were diminished, smaller, fewer, cautious. They hunted in the shadows, creeping from burrows at night, their dominance fractured into survival. Yet they did not vanish. Some still prowled riverbanks, snapping at insects and small reptiles. Others lingered in forests, furtive, wary of the Archosaurs now rising around them. Their eyes gleamed with a different kind of persistence, one not of immediate power, but of endurance stretched thin across millennia. They were no longer kings, but neither were they entirely gone. Their bloodline carried the whisper of mammals yet to come. The Archosaur ascendants. Against these synapsids, the Archosaurs moved with growing confidence. Their strides were longer, their lungs stronger, their jaws lined with sharper teeth. They did not cling to shadows, they walked into the open sun, their bodies built for pursuit. Where synapsids retreated, Archosaurs expanded. Where synapsids hid, Archosaurs thrived. It was not a sudden conquest, not a single battle won, but a slow, relentless edging out. Across deserts and rivers, forests and lagoons, Archosaurs spread. Each year, each generation, their shadows grew longer, while the synapsids faded further into obscurity. Amphibians at the edge. Amphibians, too, lingered, relics of earlier ages. They clung to wetlands and streams, their soft skins binding them to water. Some grew large, bulky hunters of fish and insects, their eyes bulging from the shallows as they snapped at whatever strayed near. But the land was no longer theirs to claim. Beyond the edge of water, reptiles moved freely, their scales proof against dryness, their eggs safe from desiccation. Amphibians lived, but only in margins. The Age of Reptiles pressed them into corners, leaving them shadows of their once great reign. The contest of time. The rivalry of bloodlines was not loud. It was not fought in singular battles, but in countless small encounters across millennia. A synapsid struck down by an archosaur near a riverbank. A reptile's egg safe upon dry soil where an amphibian's spawn could not survive. A herd of early herbivores growing larger, eating more, leaving little for others. Survival was the battlefield, adaptation the weapon, time itself the judge. And time favored the reptiles. The balance tilts. Slowly the balance shifted. Synapsids retreated into niches, reduced to furtive survivors. Amphibians clung stubbornly but lost the center of the land. Insects swarmed endlessly, feeding reptiles more than any other. And archosaurs grew in number, in size, in confidence. Their bloodlines fanned outward, splitting, branching, diversifying. The contest was not over, but the outcome was written in the rhythm of time. Reptiles were no longer one lineage among many. They were becoming the lineage that defined the age. The Age of Reptiles was not born from silence alone. It was forged in rivalry, in the slow displacement of other bloodlines, in the persistence of scales over fur and skin. By patience and adaptability, by tooth and claw, they claimed what others lost, and in doing so, they stepped fully into their reign. Even in the Triassic, Long before thunderous herds shook the ground or feathered wings brushed the sky, the future was stirring in silence. It was hidden in the smallest details, in a scale that caught the light differently, in a limb lifted a little higher, in a breath drawn deeper. The world was not only filled with survivors, it was quietly inventing what was to come. The subtle seeds of change. Among the Archosaurs, some bore traits that set them apart. Their hips tilted more upright, their strides straighter, their movements quicker. Their bodies carried the blueprint of forms yet unrealized, the first whispers of dinosaurs. They were not giants yet, not lords of land, but in their bones, time was sketching new possibilities. Their steps were lighter, their lungs stronger, their speed greater. They looked much like their kin, yet carried within them the spark of a lineage that would dominate the next 150 million years. If you had stood on a Triassic plain and watched them, you might not have known you were glimpsing the future, but you would have felt it in the way they moved, in the confidence of their stride, in the shadow of promise they cast upon the earth. Hints of feather and flight. Elsewhere, some reptiles bore tiny filaments upon their skin, not yet the true feathers of birds, but threads of possibility. To human eyes, they would seem like delicate wisps, insulating their bodies, catching sunlight in faint halos. These were the first quiet steps toward flight, toward wings that would one day beat against the sky. In twilight forests, small creatures leapt from branch to branch, their bodies light, their movements nimble. They did not fly yet, but they hinted at the sky's eventual inheritance. Above them, the moon rose, and in their shadows, the air itself seemed to whisper of futures yet unseen, of raptors and birds, of wings that would span from horizon to horizon. The ocean's hidden songs. In the seas, too, whispers stirred. Ichthyosaurs swam in sleek arcs, their bodies tuned to the deep. They were not finished shapes, but beginnings, experiments in speed and endurance. Each generation brought sharper streamlining, keener senses, more mastery of the water. Their descendants would one day rival dolphins in grace, sharks in power. But here in the Triassic, they were rehearsing, practicing the symphony of the ocean that would crescendo in ages to come. The earth prepares. Even the land itself whispered of change. Tectonic forces shifted beneath Pangaea, preparing to split the great continent apart. Valleys deepened, mountains rose, fault lines stretched. The stage that had been so vast and unified would not remain so. In the distant future, seas would pour into rifts, and continents would drift like rafts across the globe. The reptiles, already everywhere, would ride these changes into new lands, new realms, new dominions. The earth itself seemed to anticipate them, shaping a stage wide enough for their reign. The quiet of becoming. The Triassic world did not yet roar with dinosaurs or echo with pterosaurs wheeling across the sky. It hummed softly, a prelude, a becoming. The giants had not yet thundered, the skies had not yet been filled, but all of it was there, waiting. The reptiles were whispers of futures still hidden, the quiet rehearsal before the symphony. Every scale, every breath, every footprint pressed into ancient soil was a note in a melody not yet fully sung. The Age of Reptiles had already begun, but the Age of Dinosaurs was stirring in silence, a dream not yet woken. Before the forests echoed with birdsong, before wings thundered against the sky in great flocks, there were shadows, delicate, tentative, but unmistakable. The Triassic skies, once empty save for insects drifting on the wind, began to stir with something new. Reptiles, bound for so long to land and sea, were learning to master the air. The first gliders. It began quietly, with small forms leaping from trees. Their limbs stretched wide, membranes of skin catching the air, allowing them to drift from branch to branch. They were not yet true flyers, but they were no longer bound to the earth below. In twilight forests, their silhouettes cut fleeting arcs against the fading light, glimmers of innovation in motion. The gliders were precursors, experiments shaped by evolution's patient hand. Their every leap was a rehearsal, their every glide a whisper of wings yet to come. From their courage, the possibility of flight took root. The rise of pterosaurs. But whispers soon gave way to substance. From among the Archosaurs, a new lineage emerged, pterosaurs, the first true masters of the sky. Their wings stretched wide, formed by elongated fingers that supported delicate membranes. Their bodies were light yet strong, their bones hollow, their muscles honed for flight. With each beat of their wings, they rose above rivers, deserts, and forests, tracing the land from vantage points no reptile had known before. The skies, so long untouched, belonged to them now. Imagine standing on a Triassic plain as the sun sinks low, painting the horizon in crimson and gold. From the cliffs above, shapes launch into the air, their wings vast, their shadows stretching across the ground. They circle, dive, and soar, their cries sharp against the evening breeze. The age of reptiles was no longer confined to stone and water. It had taken to the heavens. The gift of perspective. Flight gave reptiles more than freedom. It gave perspective. From above, rivers became silver ribbons, deserts endless seas of gold, forests vast carpets of green. Prey could be spotted from heights, predators avoided with a single sweep of wings. Food was not limited to the ground. Insects filled the skies, drifting in clouds that pterosaurs sliced through with precision. The air became a highway, connecting lagoons to rivers, rivers to forests, forests to deserts. Reptiles of the sky became messengers of the age, their wings beating stories from one horizon to another. Nights of soaring shadows. At dusk, pterosaurs lingered in the fading light, their wings glowing orange as they passed before the sinking sun. At night, under stars, they glided silently, their silhouettes black against the Milky Way. Some perched on cliff edges, their long beaks tucked under wings as they rested. Others circled even in darkness, eyes sharp, senses keen, tracing the air with tireless grace. Their shadows stretched over land and sea, reminders that the skies were no longer empty. Where once only stars and insects moved, now wings carved the heavens with living presence. The inheritance of the air. The shadows of flight were not only pterosaurs, they were promises of what would come. Feathers were stirring on tiny creatures in the forests, waiting for their time. The air, once alien to reptiles, had become familiar. The future of birds, of raptors, of song and migration, all began here in the shadows of flight that first brushed against the Triassic sky. The reptiles had taken the land, they had reclaimed the seas, and now, with wings stretched wide, they had claimed the sky. The age of reptiles was no longer bound. It was everywhere, beneath stone, upon rivers, within forests, across deserts, and now soaring beneath the eternal stars. From whispers in the shadows and wings gliding through twilight, the reptiles pressed forward into something larger, louder, and unmistakable. The Triassic had tested them with fire and famine, with deserts and storms, with rivals that clung stubbornly to life. But now, a new shape was rising among them, the true dinosaurs, a lineage born not of fragility, but of strength, poised to stride across the land with an authority no creature had yet known. The first true steps. The earliest dinosaurs were not giants yet. They were lean, agile, built for speed and endurance. Their hips tilted beneath them in an upright stance, their legs carrying them forward in confident strides. Where other reptiles sprawled low to the ground, dinosaurs lifted themselves higher, their tails balancing their movements, their bodies streamlined for motion. Across the plains of Pangaea, they marched in silence at first, their footsteps muffled against dry soil. But with each passing age, those steps grew louder. Small, swift hunters darted across deserts and river valleys, their claws flashing in the sun. Early plant-eaters gathered in cautious groups, their teeth grinding leaves and ferns, their heads lifting often to scan for danger. They were not yet thunderous, but the earth had begun to feel their rhythm. The slow emergence of power. At first, they seemed almost unremarkable among other archosaurs, but their advantages multiplied. They were faster, their lungs more efficient, their bodies better suited for both endurance and bursts of speed. They learned to gather in groups, to move with one another, to share both protection and opportunity. Predators among them grew sharper, lean hunters with jaws filled with serrated teeth. They did not simply snap, they tore. Their prey was not chosen from weakness alone, but pursued with vigor, with strategy, with relentless motion. The world was beginning to tilt in their favor. The plains of Pangaea. On open plains where conifers stood in scattered clusters and the horizon stretched endlessly, the first dinosaurs traced their march. Imagine a dawn upon these lands, mist rising from the ground, the sun painting gold across the sky. From that haze, a group emerges, tall, upright tails swaying in counterbalance as they move with quiet confidence. Their shadows stretch long across the soil, dark marks that reach toward the horizon. Other reptiles scatter at their approach, some darting into burrows, others slipping into rivers. The land feels changed, as though it has been claimed not by chance, but by inevitability. Predators and prey in balance. The march of the mighty was not one of conquest alone. With predators came prey, with hunters came grazers. Early herbivores grew stronger, their bodies deepening, their teeth broadening to strip conifer branches with ease. They gathered in herds for safety, their numbers creating walls of protection against pursuit. Predators tested these walls, circling, waiting, lunging when opportunity allowed. Each encounter was shaping. Prey pushed predators to grow sharper. Predators forced prey to grow stronger. Together, they escalated, pulling one another upward into forms more specialized, more powerful, more dominant. The earth begins to tremble. As the Triassic aged, the steps of dinosaurs grew heavier. Their numbers multiplied, their range expanded. What was once scattered and tentative became steady, deliberate, unstoppable. From rivers to forests, deserts to mountains, their presence pressed outward like a tide. The earth itself seemed to recognize their rise. Footprints pressed into mud hardened into stone, leaving trails that would endure for millions of years. Each print was a declaration. The march had begun. The dawn of dominion. They were not yet the colossal sauropods of the Jurassic, nor the apex predators of the Cretaceous. But the line had been drawn. The Archosaurs had splintered, the rivals had faded, and the dinosaurs had stepped into their place. The march of the mighty was not a sprint. It was a steady, patient progression, each generation carrying the lineage further, stronger, bolder. The Triassic had forged them in silence, tested them with extremes, honed them through rivalry, and now they were ready to carry their reign forward into the next age. The ground beneath their feet carried the echoes of futures yet to come. The Age of Reptiles was no longer just survival, it had become dominion. The Triassic world was never shaped by land alone. Just as rivers carved their paths and deserts stretched endlessly beneath the sun, the seas and coastlines wrote their own chapters. The Age of Reptiles was not confined to one realm. It was a balance, a tapestry woven across earth and water alike, and reptiles had mastered both. The dual kingdoms. On land, dinosaurs began their steady rise. Hunters stalking the plains, herbivores gathering in cautious herds, archosaurs claiming forests and riversides. Yet in the oceans, their cousins had already taken hold. Ichthyosaurs glided with dolphin-like grace through the waves, long-necked plesiosaurs twisted elegantly in shallow bays, and smaller marine reptiles darted like silver shadows through kelp and reef. It was as though the reptiles had drawn a line of continuity from soil to water, ensuring that wherever life could thrive, their scales would shine. The coastal crossroads. The balance was most visible along coastlines. Here, rivers met the sea in lagoons and estuaries rich with life. Dinosaurs prowled the muddy edges, their footprints pressed into the soil alongside tracks of archosaurs and synapsids clinging to survival. Insects swarmed above reeds, amphibians croaked in shaded pools, and reptiles of every kind mingled in the delicate interplay of predator and prey. Offshore, shadows slipped beneath the water's surface. A fish leaping into the air might vanish in an instant between the jaws of a marine hunter. The sound of waves was often interrupted by the splash of pursuit, the struggle of survival playing out where land and sea met in eternal rhythm. The sea's dominion. In open waters, reptiles had become lords. Ichthyosaurs moved in swift packs, their movements coordinated, scattering fish schools into silver storms. Plesiosaurs lingered near reefs, their long necks weaving like serpents as they struck with precision. Crocodile-like reptiles lurked near shorelines, slipping between water and land, masters of both. The seas were no longer empty graveyards of extinction. They were living kingdoms, their power balanced by predators above and below the surface. Where waves rolled, reptiles ruled. The land's authority. Yet the land carried its own dominion. Dinosaurs, still small by later standards, pressed their authority into every terrain. Swift hunters tested the edges of herds. Plant-eaters stripped branches from conifers, their numbers enough to alter entire forests. Even deserts, once nearly barren, echoed with reptilian presence. Lizards darting across dunes, archosaurs prowling river oases, and titans pressing slow paths across sands. The land belonged to them as surely as the sea belonged to their cousins, and together their reign grew into a balance no other lineage had achieved, a harmony of dominion. A world in equilibrium. To stand in the Triassic was to witness a world finely balanced between land and sea. The reptiles did not rule one at the expense of the other. Instead, they spread their mastery across both, weaving a dual kingdom that spanned every horizon. From the deepest lagoons to the tallest forests, from open plains to open waters, they were present, constant, unyielding. The Earth had not seen such balance before, and it would never again see an age so wholly shaped by one lineage, a lineage of scale and silence, of tooth and claw, of persistence across realms. The Age of Reptiles had claimed deserts and rivers, forests and lagoons. Now, in the balance of land and sea, their reign was undeniable. The world itself had bent to their adaptability, their resilience, their quiet but certain power. And yet, even this balance would not remain untouched. Change, as always, was coming. The Triassic would soon close, and with it, the reptiles' steady march would transform into thunder. The Triassic had begun in silence, a world scarred by extinction, a land emptied of its rulers. It ended in thunder. By the close of this age, reptiles had spread into every corner of Pangaea, their shadows stretching across deserts, forests, rivers, and seas. Yet as the Triassic gave way to the Jurassic, the Earth trembled once more, reshaping the balance of life. Extinction came again, sudden and sharp, clearing the stage for what was to follow, the full reign of the dinosaurs. The gathering of storms. Pangaea, though mighty, was restless. Rifts opened in its crust, volcanoes rumbled, and fire bled through stone. Vast eruptions tore across the land, filling the skies with ash and choking the air with smoke. The climate wavered between searing heat and sudden chill. Seasons grew unpredictable. Rivers swelled and dried in strange cycles, forests burned, and even the seas shifted in turbulence. For many creatures, it was too much. Amphibians dwindled further, their grip on the edges of rivers and lakes slipping away. Some synapsids clung on, but the changing climate narrowed their refuge. Even some reptiles, though resilient, faltered beneath the strain. But others endured, and those who endured were poised to expand. The last Triassic voices. In the final days of the Triassic, the world still carried diversity. Small reptiles darted through forests, pterosaurs traced shadows across the sky, ichthyosaurs glided through oceans. But many lineages that had once seemed strong began to vanish. Predators once common grew scarce. Entire families disappeared, their stories closed in silence. The air grew heavy with endings, but also with beginnings. For those who survived, space opened, opportunities spread wide. The Triassic was closing its curtain, but the stage was far from empty. The threshold of the Jurassic. Out of the survivors stepped the dinosaurs. No longer lean whispers of what they might become, they now stood ready to claim the mantle of dominance. Herds swelled in number. Predators grew sharper, faster, more relentless. Their forms multiplied, branching outward, diversifying into shapes suited for plains, forests, and mountains alike. The Triassic had tested them, but the Jurassic would crown them. What had begun as cautious steps across fragile ground was about to erupt into thunderous marches that shook the continents. The reptiles ascendant. It was not only the dinosaurs. The skies still belonged to pterosaurs, who grew larger, bolder, their wings spanning ever wider. The seas, too, teemed with reptilian rulers, ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs weaving dominance through waves. The Age of Reptiles had grown beyond mere survival. It had become a global reign, stretching from the deepest oceans to the highest cliffs, from deserts shimmering with heat to forests whispering in shade. The Triassic had been a proving ground. Now, the world has opened its doors to an empire. A world transformed. As the last fires of the Triassic dimmed, the world was ready for transformation. Pangaea still held together, but cracks had formed. Soon, seas would pour into new valleys and continents would drift apart. Climate would shift, landscapes would change, but the reptiles were prepared. They had already claimed every realm, now they would claim them more fully than ever before. The Triassic ended not with silence, but with a handover from survival to supremacy, from whispers to thunder. The reptiles had weathered the hardest of trials. Now nothing stood in their way. The Triassic had been the dawn. The Jurassic would be the morning sun, blazing and unstoppable. And as one age closed and another began, the reptiles marched forward, their reign expanding into the golden heart of the Mesozoic. By the time the Triassic yielded to the Jurassic, the reptiles had done more than endure, they had claimed the Earth. Their presence stretched from the smallest crevices to the grandest horizons, from desert stones to ocean depths, from forest shadows to the open skies. The world was theirs, woven through with scales and claws, teeth and tails. The land's dominion. On the plains of Pangaea, the first true dinosaurs moved with growing confidence. Their footprints pressed into the soil, deep and deliberate, leaving trails that marked the spread of their kind. Hunters stalked silently across open fields, lean bodies swaying in rhythm with the land. Herbivores gathered in herds, their teeth grinding the needles of conifers, their eyes wide and watchful as they moved together for safety. Each landscape echoed with their presence. Forests whispered with their rustling, deserts carried the faint prints of their claws, and mountains reverberated with the weight of their steps. Land was no longer a contested realm. It had been claimed, filled, defined by reptiles. The sea's power. Beneath the waves, Ichthyosaurs glided in sleek arcs, their bodies streamlined into perfection. Plesiosaurs twisted long necks through schools of darting fish, striking with serpentine grace. Crocodilian kin lurked in shallows, slipping silently between worlds, hunting where land kissed sea. The oceans were no longer graveyards of extinction, but kingdoms of motion, their predators reptilian through and through. From shallow lagoons to deep waters, the seas pulsed with the rhythm of scaled dominion. The skies unbound. Above it all, wings traced the heavens. Pterosaurs soared on thermal currents, their cries sharp against the winds. They dove from cliffs, skimmed over waters, circled above forests in search of prey. The air itself, once ruled only by insects, now thrummed with the steady beat of reptilian wings. The world had been threefold: land, sea, sky, and reptiles had claimed them all. A global reign. The Age of Reptiles was no longer just survival after catastrophe. It was a reign, it was dominion. Across every horizon, the world bore their mark. The scales beneath the sun and moon, the claws pressed into mud, the wings that cut through starlight, all were signs of a lineage that had risen from ashes and silence to command the earth. No creature rivaled them now. Amphibians lingered only in shadows, synapsids survived in furtive corners, but reptiles were everywhere. Their adaptability had turned scarcity into strength, their patience into power. The world had bent to their persistence. The promise of ages to come. The Triassic had been their beginning. The Jurassic and Cretaceous awaited, filled with promise of grandeur yet unseen, giants that would tower higher, predators that would grow sharper, wings that would stretch wider than any before. The world was ready to bloom with their diversity, their majesty, their thunder. But even here, at the close of the Triassic, the story was clear. The Age of Reptiles was not a passing moment. It was an empire of time, a reign that would last for more than 150 million years. The Earth had been claimed by scales on stone, by tails sweeping sand, by wings carving sky, by shadows gliding through seas. The silence of extinction was long gone. In its place, the world sang with reptiles everywhere, eternal, unyielding. The Triassic had opened the chapter. The Jurassic would write it in thunder. The Triassic had opened in silence, a world shattered, its ecosystems broken, its rulers gone. Yet out of that silence, a new story had taken shape. Small reptiles creeping between stones became hunters, wanderers, swimmers, climbers. Their shadows lengthened into Archosaurs, their bodies stretched into titans, their wings brushed against the sky. By the time the Triassic closed, the reptiles were no longer survivors. They were sovereigns. From ashes to dominion. What had begun as fragile sparks in the ruins of the Great Dying had grown into a fire that illuminated the world. Reptiles had not been conquered by sudden force, but by persistence. They spread one habitat at a time, desert, river, lagoon, forest, sea, sky, until there was no realm untouched by their presence. Each challenge had shaped them, each trial had forged them. Fire and famine, drought and storm, rivals and rivals fadding, all had prepared them for the reign ahead. The crown of time. This was not a reign of days or centuries, but of millions upon millions of years. The age of reptiles stretched ahead, vast and unbroken, carrying with it the promise of diversity and grandeur. Dinosaurs would rise to tower over forests, their steps shaking the earth. Pterosaurs would spread wings that darkened the sky. Marine reptiles would carve the seas into kingdoms of power and grace. The silence of the Permian's end had given way to a symphony, scales against stone, wings against wind, tails sweeping through water. The earth no longer waited for life to return. It thrummed with reptilian presence, steady and undeniable. The reign unfolds. To witness the close of the Triassic was to feel the shift of destiny itself. The reptiles had proven not just that they could survive, but that they could become the very pulse of the planet. From this point onward, the Mesozoic would be theirs, a canvas upon which they would paint in thunder and shadow, in wings and scales, in forms that would inspire awe long after their time had ended. The long reign had begun. A cozy, closing reflection. And so, as the Triassic sun sets and the Jurassic dawn begins, we pause here, in this quiet between ages. Imagine lying beneath the stars of that ancient sky, the ground still warm beneath your back, the air carrying the scent of resin and salt, the hush of distant waves. Around you, shadows stir, reptiles of every size, moving with patient confidence into tomorrow. Above you, the constellations burn bright, indifferent to ages, yet bearing witness to all. The story of the reptiles has only just opened. Their footsteps echo softly now, but soon they will thunder. Their wings glide in small arcs now, but soon they will span horizons. Their reign has begun in whispers, but it will unfold in glory. The age of reptiles has claimed the earth. The long reign stretches forward, waiting to be told.